All right, before we continue our discussion of logical fallacies, I want to give you an example and an exercise to think about. We talked some about Bill Clinton and one of his examples. Let's talk about Hillary Clinton. And I respect them both as politicians, but they've committed some logical fallacies. So think back to, if you can, 2015, 2016, when on the Democratic side of the race in the US, it was Bernie Sanders, the liberal kind of democratic socialist, going against Hillary Clinton. So it was they were kind of even. Both had a good chance of becoming the Democratic candidate for president. And I'm going to give you an example from a debate between Sanders and Clinton. So Hillary Clinton was once a senator from the state of New York, and she was a senator when the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened in New York City. And that's kind of a background for her response, which I'll read to you in a minute. Now, during the campaign of 2015, 2016, during the campaign, Hillary Clinton took some campaign donations, campaign money, from a group of Wall Street bankers, very rich bankers on Wall Street. And she had a private meeting with some of them. She refused to explain what she talked about and what she said to them. They invited her to give a private talk, and they gave her some money for this. And she was refusing to tell people what she talked about and what she told them, if she made them any promises or anything. So one time Sanders and Clinton were having a debate, a formal debate, and this is on TV. So Sanders asked Clinton about this, and Sanders said, "Well, why do they make millions of dollars of campaign contributions? They expect to get something. Everybody knows that." Trying to imitate Sanders. He has a unique speaking style. Clinton responded like this. Listen to her response. "Oh, wait a minute, Senator. You know, not only do I have hundreds of thousands of donors," people giving her money, donors, "most of them small," meaning people who give small amounts of money. "And I'm very proud that for the first time a majority of my donors are women, 60%. So I represented New York as a senator, and I represented New York on 9/11 when we were attacked. Where were we attacked? We were attacked in downtown Manhattan, where Wall Street is. I did spend a whole lot of time and effort helping them rebuild. That was good for New York, it was good for the economy, and it was a way to rebuke the terrorists who had attacked our country." What do you think of that response? Was that an honest response? Was it a response that people would have found credible, believable? Or did she commit some logical fallacies? I want you to pause the video for a while and talk about this example, and we'll come back. Okay, we're back. What did you think? This is an interesting example. She's a smart woman. She's a very good policy expert, and I respect her as a senator and as a former Secretary of State. But I think she had some problems with honesty, and though she was smart and she would have made a better president than the one we have now, she had problems with honesty and maybe relating to the average person. And this is one example where she came across as not honest. So she was asked about her connections with Wall Street banks and donations, political donations from Wall Street banks to her campaign. Her response, one, she talks about how a lot of her donors, people giving money to her campaign, are kind of small donors, average people, including a lot of women. And yeah, that's great. It's great that a lot of small donors, including especially women, gave to her campaign, but it's not related to the question. The question is about you and the Wall Street bankers, and responds with this. So one, it's kind of a distraction, maybe a non sequitur, perhaps, that doesn't follow logically. It's not a logical response to the question. It's also kind of an ad populum, I think. She's appealing to kind of popular feelings, small donors, average person, women, women's rights, feminism. And those are very good ideas, but she's making an emotional appeal based to that in a way that's not related to the question. It's kind of an ad populum, or kind of a populist or popular argument, an emotional argument to the masses, to the public, which is not logically related to the question. So it's a way of not answering the question. It's a distraction. It's a diversion. I would also say it's, and then especially, and same thing when she talks about 9/11 and how that's another kind of ad populum, talking about 9/11. That's kind of an emotional thing for Americans, very sensitive thing. Terrorism, terrorists, very emotionalistic appeals here. And it's not related. And I would also maybe say it's maybe a red herring. It's a distraction, it's a diversion. Perhaps it's at least a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically. So you could say it's a red herring or it's a non sequitur, and it's definitely an ad populum. Emotionalistic responses, these are emotional arguments, emotional appeals that have nothing to do with the question. By standing with the Wall Street bankers, you're standing against terrorism? That doesn't make sense. Okay, that doesn't make logical sense. Now, I wish she had won the election. She would, or Sanders, but she did not come across here as honest. She was not really the best icon or representation of feminism, of a feminist candidate. Now, in the past year, here in 2020, before Biden became kind of the main Democrat, there were a number of good women running for president. A number of good women candidates, and there was one that I really liked, and I would have voted for her. She would have been my best choice, but she didn't do too well, unfortunately, and so we've got Biden. Biden also doesn't always, it's not always logical. Maybe we'll see some logical fallacies from him during the campaign. We'll obviously see a lot of logical fallacies from Trump, because he uses those a lot. So that's one example of a fallacy in politics, and there are many examples. So I'm going to ask you again to pick a fallacy from politics or from commercial advertising and talk about it for your assignment after we finish these other talks on fallacies. Okay. Next we've got empirical fallacies, or empirical has to do with evidence or data, so claims made without good evidence or data. So there's hasty generalization and overgeneralization, which are kind of similar. I mean, maybe they overlap. Hasty, that is overly quick. Oh, the team is doing badly. The coach ought to be fired. Well, maybe he needs time. Maybe it's too early to tell. Okay. Overgeneralization. So don't overgeneralize. It's always wrong. Okay. For example, journalist maybe talks to one person, and maybe if it's not a good journalist, they'll make an overgeneralization. Oh, look at those bad foreigners. The bad foreigners, they're causing problems. Overgeneralizing about foreigners, overgeneralizing about a certain race, certain groups of people. Sometimes popular news media do this when they misrepresent health and medical research. The Mozart effect was overgeneralized based on one poor study. They misreport, they overgeneralize maybe based on one study that is not in itself definitive. Making claims based on insufficient evidence, insufficient statistical evidence. For example, and these get into maybe other ways in which people might misreport, maybe science or health research. Biased examples. Maybe the best example is this. There was a presidential election in the US in 1948. The Democrat was Truman, the Republican was Dewey. Of course, newspapers were doing polls, conducting opinion polls at this time. And they started phone polls, calling people on telephones and asking them who you're going to vote for. And the polls indicated that Dewey would win. And so there's a famous example of a Chicago newspaper, based on the poll, the night of the election, they printed the morning edition, the morning newspaper for the next morning, saying Dewey wins, when actually Truman won. And the problem was this was 1948, and not many people had landline phones at the time, only wealthier people, and it was the wealthier people who tended to vote Republican. And so they had a bad sample, biased samples. In the 1990s, early 2000s, there was a similar problem as we were moving from landline phones to cell phones or mobile phones. And again, at first, richer people had cell phones and poor people relied on landline phones. And so for a while, there were again problems if a poll was conducted mainly by landline telephone polls, calling people who had traditional landline telephones, or a poll based on cell phone calls. There are a couple of other here. Selective reporting, that's kind of similar, focusing on just a small group of people and making conclusions based on that. Next, let's move on to complex fallacies. You see these in politics, but also sometimes in academic contexts. First one is special pleading. And that's when you maybe only look at points supporting one position and you don't really consider other points, especially if it's a complex topic. A classic example in textbooks, whether it's a book in a writing class or in a logic class, classic example would be maybe debates about the value of religion. So I'm not citing this because of my own interest in the topic, because this is just a classic textbook example. So think about people like Richard Dawkins, the famous scientist who angrily argues against religion. And I think he has some good points, but his position is too simplistic. He does not consider maybe the more positive forms of religion or more positive aspects of religion. He just argues that religion is all bad, and he focuses on all the negative aspects of religion. And while I agree with his points, I think it's too simplistic, because you have to have, for a complex topic like this, you have to engage in a debate that is more nuanced. That is, you consider the complexities, you consider the different aspects and the different viewpoints. And clearly, there have been some positive aspects of religion in history. You have to admit that. For some people, it has had some benefits. I would argue that those benefits are at a cost, and you can argue that. But I think that you also have to be sensitive, because this is a topic that's really important and meaningful to a lot of people. And you can't just be insulting, and you can't just say that religion is entirely bad. You could make a case, maybe, if you are careful in how you argue for it, but you have to consider the different aspects. And I happen to have an academic interest in the study of religion myself, so I'm kind of sensitive to this. I can easily see the negative aspects, but I can also see the positive aspects, and they go together. It's hard to separate them, actually. So if you're talking about a complex topic like this, you have to consider both sides and the complexities, the nuances. All right, now there's one more complex fallacy that's often discussed in textbooks about logic and reasoning and argumentation. That's the Straw Man Fallacy, and it might seem kind of similar in some ways to the others. The special pleading, for example, might be similar to some of the empirical fallacies if it's more of a pure research context and somebody makes an academic argument for a certain theory and they ignore certain research evidence that contradicts their views. That would be kind of one of the empirical fallacies that's in the previous section. But here under the special pleading is more like not so much ignoring a particular piece of research, but just ignoring the positive and negative aspects of an issue, the various arguments for and against something and the various complexities. So special pleading is maybe kind of an oversimplification or even an overgeneralization of the issues. Not so much an overgeneralization of facts, but an overgeneralization or oversimplifying the issues. And the examples that we gave, for example, would involve ignoring, say, positive aspects and the various complex arguments and complex issues involved in, say, arguing about whether religion is good for society. So the next one is a straw man argument, and it seems kind of similar in some ways, where you're ignoring certain evidence. In a way, it is also kind of an overgeneralization, but of a different kind. Let's say two politicians are debating, and this happens a lot in politics. And one politician has worked hard on developing maybe an economic policy program. He or she wants to become president and has a fairly well worked out set of policies and proposals for improving the economy and other issues. And the other person, the opponent, might oversimplify and overgeneralize it and say, oh, you just want to raise taxes on everybody and you want to do this and that. And that's maybe not what the other person actually wants to do. Maybe she wants to raise taxes on certain people, but reduce taxes for other people. That's an example of a straw man argument. So we call it a straw man because it involves misrepresenting what the other side actually is arguing for, or what the other person actually is arguing for, misrepresenting what is actually a complex argument and maybe overgeneralizing it or oversimplifying it. So a straw man literally is, well, a man or a person figure that's actually made out of straw, a straw man. And farmers might have put up a straw man to, I don't know, for decoration, or maybe as a scarecrow. What we call a scarecrow, to scare away crows, keep crows out of your cornfield, keep birds away from your corn. So a straw man is basically a person who's made out of straw. So rather than attacking or criticizing the actual person, you are creating a false representation of that person, a straw man. Not the real person, but a straw man. It's kind of a fake argument. You present a false portrayal of a person and attack that. Or a false picture, a false representation of someone's ideas, or a particular idea, a particular proposal. And you attack that rather than the actual argument and its merits, in its strengths and weaknesses. It's easier to oversimplify and overgeneralize and misrepresent or misstate an opponent's position and say, you believe this is what you want to do, when that's not what they want to do. That's not exactly what they want to do. This happens in academic circles sometimes. In some of your classes, you might learn about Chomsky and his ideas. Some of his ideas are a little controversial for some people. And actually, one way that his opponents have strawmanned him is lump all of his different theories together and treat it as one, and then attack that. Pick out a few weaknesses here and there and say, okay, I've disproven all of Chomsky's theories, when you haven't. One, he has different theories. There's theories about language innateness, how language is something, it's an ability that we're born with. He has theories about linguistics in general and what human language is, kind of the abstract structure and the abstract nature of language in general, and how human language is different from other things we might call language, like animal communication or computer languages. He's got theories about that. He's got particular theories about universal grammar, how grammar is a set of universal principles. And he's got theories about the abstract structure of syntax. These are all different theories. They overlap somewhat. They kind of go together in some ways. And some of his theories have kind of changed or evolved over time. So what some people will do is they will, because they're too lazy to actually understand his different theories, they will kind of lump them all together and treat them as one. And they will attack maybe one of his ideas or their misunderstandings of one of his ideas, because they haven't really tried to understand his complex ideas. They are pretty complex and abstract. They misrepresent his ideas and say he believes this and it's wrong because of this, and they attack it and they think, okay, I've presented a good argument against Chomsky's ideas, when they haven't. Now, as a linguist, I like a lot of his ideas, and some of his ideas I kind of disagree with, but I believe in a fair and accurate understanding of his ideas. So I've seen a few people who have presented some intelligent critiques or criticisms of some of his ideas. And I've seen a lot of people who really don't know enough about linguistics and linguistic theory simply engage in straw man arguments. So there are straw man attacks against Chomsky's ideas, and there are intelligent criticisms of his ideas, and that's different. So you have to be careful if you're studying linguistics. Avoid the various straw man attacks on Chomsky, and understand his ideas and read some intelligent critiques or criticisms of his ideas if you want to be a good linguist, or if you want to, deal with that stuff. For some of you, it doesn't matter. So this stuff can happen in academic circles as well. And some of Chomsky's followers have engaged in straw man attacks against opposing theories. There's enough guilt to go around. In politics, this happens a lot. I think it happens sometimes it's not just maybe conservative politicians who do it. I've seen liberal politicians or progressive politicians do it too. That is a straw man argument. The best examples in linguistics I can think of involve Chomsky and Chomsky's ideas, his ideas about syntax or grammar, or his ideas about how language is innate. It's an ability that we're born with. It's often misunderstood. Okay, here's one way somebody might attack it. Chomsky says language is an innate ability, and if given enough input, children learn automatically. Some people might misrepresent his ideas and say, oh, it doesn't matter, it just learns on its own. No. It's like the human mind, in a sense, is sort of like a computer. You could have the fanciest, most expensive, most powerful computer, but it does nothing unless you give it input. So yes, it does matter what the quality of input that a child gets, in the first, 10 years of life. The quality of input matters. Chomsky didn't really talk about social interaction, and there are people who are really interested in social interaction and language learning, and they think Chomsky, they sometimes take a very critical view of Chomsky. I think maybe it is a problem that Chomsky doesn't talk enough about the social interaction aspect of language learning. Maybe he's not interested in that. He's more concerned with just what happens here in the abstract language parts of the mind. But it doesn't mean that he dismisses social interaction necessarily, or it doesn't mean that his followers necessarily dismiss it. And so you tend to have these kind of extremes. People who take a very strong social interaction perspective in linguistics, and those who take a very abstract kind of structural perspective, and both have engaged in straw man attacks against each other. And I think that needs to stop, because it's hurting the field of linguistics. This kind of stuff is hurting the field of linguistics. Okay, so on my webpage I also have a section on cognitive biases, and I think we're not going to talk about that right now. I think we will come back to that at a later time in the course. So you have an assignment based on this, and I want you to think of real examples from your own experience that you've seen or heard, and talk about them in the assignment, and we'll see how you do, because this is going to lead up to your midterm. Your midterm is going to be a speaking assignment. So that's it for now. So have a good day, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.